Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube. And if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. This Saturday, bring your young ones to trick or treat at the museums from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Admission is free with costume. I think they mean that for the kids, but I bet if you wear one, they'll let you in for free too. We'll have Halloween-themed games and a Mississippi Mysteries scavenger hunt, and there'll be a monster march at 11:30 a.m. I'm going to come for that. And then I hope that you'll join us next week for History is Lunch, when Davis Houck will discuss his new book, Black Bodies in the River, Searching for Freedom Summer. Today, we are delighted to welcome Chris Mackowski to present the Civil War Battle of Jackson. This program is being co-sponsored by the Jackson Civil War Roundtable, and here to say a few words about that organization and to introduce our speaker is Jim Woodrick, himself the author of the book, The Civil War Siege of Jackson, Mississippi. Help me welcome Jim Woodrick.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be back and see some familiar faces. Hey, Roger. Very briefly, the Civil War Roundtable has been around a long time. In fact, as long as I have been. It was started the same year that I was born, and it promotes Civil War history, not just in Mississippi, but all over. But like many organizations, COVID and aging membership has taken its toll, and we are rebooting the Jackson Civil War Roundtable. So in the next few months, I hope you will see some announcements of some upcoming programs and come join us because it's a great group. Our speaker today is Chris Mackowski. Chris is editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Emerging Civil War website and editor of the Emerging Civil War series published by Savas Beatty Press. He earned his BA in Communication from the University of Pittsburgh, his MA in English from the University of Maine, his Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Goddard College, and a PhD in English and Creative Writing from Binghamton University. Mackowski is Professor of Communication and Associate Dean for undergraduate programs at St. Bonaventure University in Allegheny, New York. He also serves as historian in residence at Stevenson Ridge, which is a historic property on the Spotsylvania battlefield in central Virginia. And he's worked as a historian for the National Park Service at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. He's the author or co-author of nearly 24 books and editor of a half-dozen essay collections on the Civil War, including the subject of today's talk, the Battle of Jackson, Mississippi, May 14, 1863. He serves as the vice president on the board of directors for the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust and an advisor on the advisory board for the Civil War Roundtable Congress. I think that's enough, Chris. Yeah. But before I call him up, I want to share something he wrote with you in one of his many. But he has a book that comes out about every month. But this is the great what ifs of the American Civil War. I'm really enjoying it. In the introduction, he has a wonderful quote here, which I'll ask him to explain at some point. Two of the most underrated tools of the historian's trade are beer and cigars. Chris?
To be back in Jackson, Mississippi. Thank you so much for this warm, hospitable welcome. I flew in from Washington, D.C. this morning. I live in Central Virginia, and was just so tickled pink when Chris invited me and Jim extended that invitation. I was here a year ago, August, just kind of get the lay of the land, for Jackson a little bit as I was finishing up my book, and Jim was kind enough to show me around. And one of the first places he brought me here were the two Mississippi museums. And I fell in love with this facility. You guys are so lucky to have such a wonderful repository for your own history. And as Jim showed me around, and just seeing all of the preservation work that the Department of Archives and History has done throughout the Vicksburg campaign, which is what we focused on. And I got to tell you, the department is a bunch of superheroes for the work that they do in preservation. And I've traveled all over the country, and I can assure you there are not states that have the focus on preserving their own history like this state has. And then just sort of as an extra, absolutely. One of the classes I teach is actually the civil rights movement and the media, so I was particularly interested in the Civil Rights Museum. And in fact, I took a brisk walk through before we began today, just so that I could again soak it up. It's an amazing story, and I appreciate everything that this museum and the department does to embrace that story and help share it. It's a powerful, powerful story, and a privilege to bear witness to that. So, beer and cigars before we get started, because you can't, and cowboy boots too, I should also add. I'm a writer by nature, and I like to make sure that the history that I talk about is a well-told story, well-written. And I don't know about some of you in this room, but I'm sure that there are at least a few of you, when you were exposed to history early on, it was a bunch of names and dates and places, and maybe you made little flashcards to memorize them when you were in school. And it was like chewing sawdust, and it was like, oh my gosh. And I think that's history at its worst. History at its best is when you're sitting around with some like-minded folks who are passionate about the subject, and you're just shooting the breeze. And, ideally, maybe have a beer, have a cigar, and you're just talking about the thing you love, and it comes to life. And it takes on a life of its own. And we get in touch with that idea that's central to history, story. That's the main part of history. And so I think beer and cigars are a great tool to help us access that notion of these great stories that we all have, that we all love, that we can all share. And so that's why I will always say that beer and cigars are two of the best tools for exploring our own history. I'm with a group called Emerging Civil War. There are more than 30 of us. Most of us are public historians, and we all are trying to spread the gospel of the Civil War, helping people stay in touch with what we see as America's defining event. We have a blog that I would invite you to read, free content every day, www.emergingcivilwar.com. And the thing I like most about it is all these different historians have different interests, different backgrounds, different writing styles, and so there's always something new and different coming up. We do have a monthly newsletter. I have a sign-up sheet over at the book table, conveniently placed by the books that the museum bookstore has for sale over here. If you're interested in being on the email list, feel free to add your name. We don't give out email addresses to anybody. It's just a way for us to stay in contact with our readers and our viewers, and help you be part of the community, so you can see what projects we're working on, where we have speaking engagements, what books we have coming out, and those sorts of things. We'd love to have you as part of our online community. So let me slide this out of the back just a little bit, because you'll discover I don't stand still very well. So Joseph E. Johnston, Confederate commander of the Western Theater, shows up in Jackson on the late evening of May 13th, 1863. And he is not off the train more than a half an hour when he sends word back to Richmond to say, I am too late. Hasn't had the time to really assess the situation on the ground. He hasn't looked at the fortifications protecting the Mississippi capital. He hasn't had a chance to get a sense of where his own troops are, let alone where the troops of the enemy are. But he knows one thing. He doesn't want to be here. And in fact, when he left Central Tennessee on the 10th of May, he's already broadcasting to his superiors in the Confederate War Department, I am not fit for field service, but I go. So whatever happens, I told you right up front, I don't feel well. And in fact, he's been milking it for months. You might remember that Joe Johnston had a somewhat controversial career earlier in the war. He's one of the Confederacy's early heroes by scoring a victory at First Manassas. And then in the spring of 62, he spends time defending the Confederate capital by basically retreating the whole time as federal forces move up the Virginia Peninsula from Fort Monroe. And Fort Monroe's here, and the Confederate capital is that screen back there. Johnston just keeps doing this and keeps doing this and keeps doing this and keeps doing this. And so, like, nobody loves the guy, and his officers all rebel, and Confederate President Jefferson Davis tells Joe Johnston, why don't you replace Bragg? Well, now it's put up or shut up time. Like, Johnston's wanted a field command. He has the opportunity to, and he says, no, I don't want to stir things up with the pot. I don't want to, stab Bragg in the back. And then it's like later, it's like, oh, well, Bragg is sick. I don't want to replace him while he's sick. And then, oh, well, Bragg's wife is sick. I don't want to replace him while his wife's sick. And then like, oh, I'm still sick because remember, I got hurt and I don't feel it. And so it's this series of excuses. When it's time, he has the opportunity to take a field command, and he doesn't. And in the meantime, as all of this is going on in central Tennessee, he's pretending like Vicksburg doesn't exist. And eventually he'll be ordered to go out there. He'll do an inspection tour with Jefferson Davis in December of 62, and then he'll ignore it again. And then eventually he'll be preemptorily ordered to come out and pay attention to what's going on here. Now, why is that particularly important? Why is he preemptorily ordered? What's going on at the beginning of May 1863? And I have to be careful about what answer I accept here because I live in Virginia and I am now in Mississippi. And so we've got two little frames of reference there. What's happening in May of 1863? Vicksburg. Okay, it's about to happen. Absolutely. And in fact, it's been happening since the previous winter as Ulysses S. Grant keeps knocking on the door, trying to figure out how to get into Vicksburg. And he tries and he tries and he tries and he tries. He fails and he fails and he fails and he fails. And the thing I love about Grant, we'll just try again. And every time he fails, that sense of resolve that's going to drive him to eventually succeed enough to become president of the United States. That sense of resolve will keep him working at trying to find a way to Vicksburg. Now, this is particularly important for a number of reasons, and we could talk all day about the strategic importance of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, keeping it open for Confederate river traffic to get supplies from the Trans-Mississippi. But there's a really important thing that a lot of people, particularly in the East, overlook. Mississippi is Jefferson Davis's home state. This area is Jefferson Davis's hometown, right? I mean, so there's a very personal angle to all this as well. So as Grant is trying to get to Vicksburg, it's not just the strategic situation, but it's also the very personal situation that's on Jefferson Davis's mind. Complicating that, he's having poor health, and in April, his health is so bad he can't even get out of bed for days at a time. He'll still try to work from bed as he's trying to conduct the army, but he's doing a really poor job of it. So his Secretary of War, James Seddon, who's also in poor health, will try to kind of pinch hit here. All right, so that's one big thing going on at the beginning of May of 63. But what else is going on in May of 63? Gettysburg hasn't started yet, but just right before it. So not Manassas yet. Second Manassas has already taken place, excuse me. The Battle of Chancellorsville. Okay, I know Jim's over here. I'm trying to pretend I don't hear Jim. He's over here going, Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville. I can tell I'm in the West, though. It's delightful because nobody's saying Chancellorsville. Usually if I ask this question in the East, everyone's like, Chancellorsville. Vic's what? Who? What? So it's a nice juxtaposition for me. So Chancellorsville is taking place. Chancellorsville, the Battle of Chancellorsville, which begins on May 1st, 1863, happens 55 miles north of Richmond. And so all of the media attention, north and south, is being sucked up by this movement in the East. And so everyone, Jefferson Davis literally has the Union Army moving in his backyard there through central Virginia. So all attention is focused on what's going on at Chancellorsville, which allows Grant to make his attempt to get across the river at Bruinsburg and start moving into Mississippi's interior. As he successfully crosses the river, he's got to get away from the river, and he's got to get away from the bayou system around the Big Black. So he heads into the interior of the state rather than just going up along the river, which would be the most direct route to Vicksburg. He doesn't want to get caught in that V between the Mississippi and the Big Black. So he's going to swing out and around and head north to cut the railroad that runs between Jackson and Vicksburg. That's the supply line that's keeping John Pemberton's army alive. And if he can cut that, it's going to be the beginning of the end for John Pemberton. So there's a tremendous amount of context going on at this moment that's extremely distracting. If we want to add in one more element, we've got Benjamin Grierson's raid that has gone down through the center of Mississippi to disrupt things and draw John Pemberton's attention away. John Pemberton, the Confederate commander in charge of Vicksburg, is a great illustration of the Peter Principle. He has been promoted well beyond his capabilities. Nice enough guy. He got married. He's a Pennsylvanian who got married to a Southerner, and I don't know how it works in your family, but my wife tells me to do something, I'm going to do it. And so that's why he throws his lot with the Confederacy. But he's in over his head. And in April and early May, he doesn't know where to look with all of these things going on. And he's getting no guidance from Richmond because they're all paying attention to the Army of the Potomac moving through Vicksburg. Who should be in charge? Joe Johnston, who's sitting in Tullahoma, Tennessee, pretending that Vicksburg doesn't exist. And if you read his correspondence at this time, he's sending extremely helpful notes like, keep your eye on Grant. If Grant crosses the river, it'll be a problem. Like, oh yeah, really? Okay, newsflash there. And it's finally this peremptory order that comes from James Seddon that says, go to Vicksburg and take command of the armies there. Johnston's like, although not fit for field service, I will go. And he hops in the train, and it's going to take him 3 days to get down here. In the meantime, Grant has continued his advance into the interior of the state, first setting his eyes on Raymond, and from there he intends to go straight north to cut off the railroad station somewhere between Clinton and Edwards Station. Grant knows that Pemberton has troops, most of whom he thinks are still in the city, but he's getting reports that there's some movement outside of the city. In fact, all that's going on because Pemberton doesn't know what to do either. He's under orders to defend Vicksburg. That's what the president of the Confederacy has told him. But in one of those really helpful messages that he gets from Joe Johnston, Johnston says, hey, don't sacrifice your army. Retreat from Vicksburg to save your troops. Do I defend the city or abandon the city? Again, really helpful guidance. Because of everything that's going on, there's this fog of war that's hanging over Pemberton's head at this time. And Grant will exploit that fully. He gets to Raymond, where he has this unexpected encounter with a brigade that has marched up from Louisiana and John Gregg's men, and they have this big fight, and Gregg at first gets the jump on Grant's forces, and then Grant's superior numbers just kind of pile on in. You know, Gregg's got about 3,500 guys. Grant in total has somewhere just shy of about 30,000. Not great odds if you're a Confederate, fantastic odds if you're a Federal. And it just takes a while for Grant to get all his guys in line. So Gregg falls back to Jackson. Now, one of the tricks we do when we're doing battlefield tours is we use you as the map. So I'm about to turn all y'all into Mississippi for just a second, okay? And if this is Jackson, then this road right here is going to be the road that would take us out to Raymond. Right. This is the road that's going to take us out to Clinton. And if we decide that we want to escape, we're going to go past the curtain, past the book table, and out the door to Canton. All right? When Joe Johnston arrived at the train station on the 13th of May, one of the first people he talks to is John Gregg, who just had his hind end handed to him at the Battle of Raymond. And Gregg is like, there's like 1 million Yankees out there, and they're all over here too. And Gregg doesn't have a clear idea of exactly how the Federals are deployed out in the interior. All he knows is that there seems to be a lot of them, that they're moving aggressively, and that's really what convinces Johnston that he can't hold Jackson. Now, Jackson, by this point, is a well-fortified city. Let's take a look at the edge of our stage here. And these are basically going to be the earthworks that have been created around the city center to help protect it. Governor Pettus, when he first hears about Grant crossing the river, panics and he sends word off to Jefferson Davis, and he mobilizes everybody in the area that he can. The works first begin to get constructed because Pettus conscripts every black person on every area, plantation and farm and free person, and he gets them in and they start digging. And that doesn't go fast enough. So then he starts conscripting all the white people and gets them start to digging too. Promises everybody free lunches, we'll pay you for your work. Dig, 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 dig. Meanwhile, most of the population is freaking out. And so these fortifications that encircle the city anchor on the Pearl River in the north and south. And I do want to point out that they were primarily built by enslaved labor to protect the white citizenry. It's going to come in useful for us and useful for Grant in just a few moments. So as Grant begins to figure out what he wants to do in the wake of the battle at Raymond, he looks at his options. And originally I said he wanted to go straight north and cut the railroad. But now he understands that Gregg has fallen back here, and he's gotten word that Joe Johnston has arrived. And Grant will later say that Johnston was one of the Confederacy's most capable commanders. He's got a lot of respect for Johnston. Okay? And so now maybe there's a credible threat in Grant's rear. If he just goes north, Johnston here in Jackson could come up behind him and hit him from behind, even as Pemberton maybe comes out from Vicksburg and hits him from the front. And Grant would be caught in what's called a pincer movement. So Grant makes the fateful decision to actually shift his objective. And instead of cutting the railroad, he's going to come to Jackson, try to capture the capital, flush out Johnston, get rid of the threat to his rear before he pushes forward toward Vicksburg. For the Confederates who are in this city, they're actually feeling pretty good. And of course, as I said, the citizenry is all panicked. But the soldiers who are here, there's a garrison under John Adams who's been holding the city. They've got word of all sorts of reinforcements that are coming in. There are more than 12,000 reinforcements that are converging on the city. And Joe Johnston is here to lead us. Now, let me give you a picture of Johnston. He's a 1926 graduate of West Point, very distinguished looking. And he's not one of those guys that men would get overly familiar with. One soldier describes him thus: "Fancy, if you please, a man about 50 years old. In fact, he's 56. Rather small of stature, but firmly built, an open countenance, and a keen, restless eye that seemed to read your inmost thoughts. In dress, he was a perfect dandy. He ever wore the finest clothes that could be obtained, carrying out in dress and the paraphernalia of the soldier the plan adopted by the War Department in Richmond, never omitting anything, even to the trappings of his horse, bridle, and saddle. His head was decorated with a star and feather, his coat with every star and embellishment, and he wore a bright new sash, big gauntlets, and silver spurs. He was the very picture of a general." This is the man the Confederates are pinning their hopes on, not realizing that he has already sent a telegram to Richmond saying, "I am too late." He also sends word to John Pemberton in Vicksburg, and he says, "I'm going to stay in Jackson and fix the attention of the Federals, and I want you to march out of Vicksburg and come up on them from behind." Now, if we sort of take the numbers that Johnston would have available to him here in the city, and we add Pemberton's, he's going to have somewhere in the neighborhood 25,000 guys. That's still not as many as Grant has, who's somewhere around 30. And I keep hedging on these numbers because I've spent long hours discussing these with several historian friends, and none of us can actually throw a dart and find a number for a variety of reasons. And besides, I'm a writer. Nobody said there'd be math involved, so I don't want to get too much into that, right? But we know that there are going to be more Federals than Confederates. But if Grant's caught between them, that puts the squeeze on him and puts him at a disadvantage. So Johnston says, this is what we're going to do. Even as he then gives orders to John Adams to begin preparations to evacuate the city and go north to camp. In other words, "Pemberton, come here. I'll wait right here. I promise. I'll be right here." Yeah. Now, the disingenuousness, I can't even say that word, disingenuousness of that set of orders is incredible. Again, the nearest I can tell, Johnston already trying to find ways to cover his behind in case things fail. He's trying to be able to pin the blame on Pemberton. "I'm not feeling well. Pemberton didn't listen to orders." And in fact, he'll issue several orders to Pemberton and messages to the War Department over the next few hours that intentionally set Pemberton up as the fall guy. Okay. Pemberton, again, caught between what his commander's telling him and what the president has told him, makes tries to make everybody happy and in turn makes nobody happy. And he'll leave part of his men in the garrison in Vicksburg. He'll send part of his men out who will wander through the Mississippi countryside and eventually stumble into the Federal Army at a place called Champion Hill on the 16th. It's a few days in advance. The important thing to know is that the Confederate commander is a bit hapless and confused and is being given contradictory orders. So Johnston begins to evacuate the city. He's going to take anything of military value that he can, send it north. Jackson, of course, is an important manufacturing center. It's an important transportation hub, an important communication center. So it's got real strategic value in the war. And so Johnston's going to try to salvage as much of it as he can before the Federals come knocking. As far as he knows, he only has a bunch of Federals coming down the railroad, coming from Clinton. Now, he only knows that because his own intelligence gathering capabilities are so battered by this point. Gregg should be feeding him information. Gregg's got cavalry with him. Cavalry acts as your eyes and ears. They can tell you what's happening out there. But Johnston ineffectively uses his cavalry, ineffectively uses his intelligence gathering capabilities, and so is rather blind to what's happening. And in fact, the Federals that he thinks are coming down the railroad from Clinton, he thinks are William T. Sherman's men. Sherman is one of Grant's subordinates. In fact, Sherman is coming down this road from Raymond. It's going to be James McPherson, James Birdseye McPherson coming this way. Ed Bars, the great Vicksburg historian, once said that the Confederacy's intelligence gathering capabilities were conspicuous by their absence. Okay. Johnston doesn't know what's coming at him. All he knows is it's time to get out of Dodge. Indeed, Grant is coming, moving on both roads toward Jackson. He leaves the Raymond area on the 13th. It's a torrential downpour. Wagons are getting mired down in the mud in low spots. Men talk about the water being a foot deep. The rain, the pouring rain, one of them writes. The drenching rain flooded the road so poorly it inhibited our ability to move. Gregg has some of his men along this road taking pot shots at the column as it advances, but they somehow aren't sending word back that there are Yankees coming down this road. And so Johnston fixes all of his attention down here. He's going to deploy what few forces that he has available that aren't involved in the retreat down this road. And if we head out down this road, not quite as far as the zoo, we're going to come to a little ridge line that was occupied by a house occupied by the O.P. Wright family, W-R-I-G-H-T. There's an empty lot today along the road where that house once stood. He's going to deploy some South Carolinians and Georgians across the road. He really only has a demi-brigade, which means he's only got part of a brigade, which means he's only got about 3 regiments for folks who don't speak Army organization. He's going to post a couple pieces of artillery out there as well to support them, and then he's going to have just a few regiments in reserve. The idea is to hold off those men as long as we can until you get word that the evacuation is complete. In the meantime, Sherman is advancing down this road. He has with him roughly 10,000 men and no real opposition. Somehow, despite the pouring rain, Sherman and McPherson have managed to stay in close contact over the night of May 13th as it turns into the 14th. And as dawn approaches, both columns approach the city at about the same time. And in fact, the first artillery along this road will send a signal to Sherman's men that contact has been made. Okay. So the lead elements of this column would be a bunch of Missourians, the 10th Missouri, acting as skirmishers. Your skirmishers act as your advanced eyes and ears, and when they bump into that Confederate artillery, they fall back and let everybody know we've got trouble up in front. And so McPherson's going to spend time consolidating his position before he finally deploys for battle. He has with him roughly 10,000 guys. They're organized in a couple different divisions. So as he finally gets men into line here, he's going to have 3 regiments across the road, supported on either side by additional regiments. And they're going to try to feel things out along this front. But the pouring rain is making it really difficult to get a sense of what sort of opposition the Confederates have. There's no way to really know. It's only 3 regiments with just a couple cannon. Those Missourians will be tasked with feeling things out again. They'll be supplemented by the 80th Ohio and the 17th Iowa. These 3 regiments are going to bear the brunt of the fighting on this front, even though they're supported on both sides. One reason you want to, and look, we happen to have 3 regiments right here lined up for us. So you guys get to be the Missourians, and you guys will be the Ohioans. I'm not offending any great Southerners here by turning you into Buckeyes. And then over here, you guys will be Iowans. Now, when we're talking about being protected on the flank, the Iowans actually are not. Now, why is it important to be protected on your flank? If I'm talking about the flank, I'm talking about the edge. Why is it important to be protected on the flank? Anybody know? All right, I'm going to recruit a couple of you into the Army for just a moment. If I can ask the 2 of you and the 2 of you to stand up for just a moment, please. I promise I won't shoot anybody. And then let me have you close ranks. So get shoulder to shoulder here, okay? Now, for purposes of illustration, I'm on the high ground, so I've got an advantage. But let's pretend I'm down here on the floor. All right, now if I am one army and you're the other, and I'm going to attack, and I attack right up the middle, how many of you can shoot at me right now? Okay, the 2 of you, but they can shoot at me too, can't they? Right? So I'm going to take direct fire from the 2 of you, and I'm going to take what's called enfilading fire from the 2 of you, okay? No, you're in a good spot. You're about to not be, though, just for that, okay? All right? So, but basically it's 4 against 1. But if I come down here before she sneaks away and I attack the flank, see, she knew it was coming. She's like, I'm about to have a bad lunch. Now how many of them can shoot at me? 1, right? At the point of contact, it's 1-on-1. Now, I still have to fight all 4 of you, but I only have to do it 1 at a time. So that's why having your flank protected, if you're her, is like she doesn't want people sneaking up on the side because she's vulnerable. So that's why the flank is so important, both for offense and defense. Let's give it up for our Army. Thank you very much. The poor Iowans, now you are all Iowans, when they're going to eventually make this charge, they are unprotected because of the topography. So they're actually going to suffer the most casualties of anybody in this fight. But because of that pouring rain, neither McPherson or Sherman are able to launch their attacks right away. Even though they arrive on the battlefield, they start to feel things out by 8. They're really kind of in position by 9. The torrential rainpour, the torrential downpour is really going to pin them in place. McPherson actually wants to wait because he's afraid that the gunpowder in the men's haversacks is going to get wet. And then they won't be able to fire at all. Meanwhile, Sherman, as he starts to get close, Johnston gets word like, oh, where did they come from? And he's going to have to strip reinforcements, the 3rd Kentucky Mounted Infantry, and send them down here to block the road. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the road out to Raymond, maybe you've been to a battlefield shopping center. I don't know if there's anything there to buy anymore, but that sort of marks the area where a lot of this action took place, with Lynch Creek right there. And if you've never bothered to stop and look at Lynch Creek, there are a couple parking lots you can stop in and get out and walk up and see the creek itself. Not a wide creek, but its banks are wicked steep, as we would say in New England. They're wicked steep. And so, because of this torrential rain, that creek has filled right up. So it's nothing that the Federals can ford. They've got to use the one bridge to get across the creek. So the Kentuckians have the opportunity to bottleneck the Federals at this spot. They bring up 4 pieces of artillery. They start shooting at the Federals. Sherman brings in 12 pieces of artillery and starts shooting back. That's a one-sided conversation that lasts 15 minutes. And the Kentuckians fall back to the area that today is roughly around Battlefield Park. But here's the key. When they fall back, they don't set this bridge on fire. Now, maybe because it's pouring rain, the bridge just doesn't catch. This is one avenue the Federals have to get across the creek, and they get it for free. And so the two brigades that initially deploy cross, switch beams, get across the river, and begin to advance again. And at first, the Kentuckians try to mount a defense outside of the works. That's not working. So then they come inside the works. They bring in a few more artillery pieces. They will actually outnumber the Confederates. They'll have 14 pieces of artillery compared to the 12. And now they'll start shooting back and forth. And as the Federals begin to deploy, they see these formidable works with 14 guns pounding at them. And that gives Sherman reason to pause. He does not want to do a frontal attack because it looks like it's going to be problematic. So Ulysses S. Grant is traveling with this column. He's going to get one of his engineers to go on a scouting mission, see if we can outflank this position. And he takes with him the 95th Ohio. And they get over here to a railroad bed, and they advance up in this direction. There's nobody here. Okay? Now, I talked earlier about the enslaved labor that made these fortifications. As it happens, there's a black man who comes up, and he's like, well, and it's one of those bottom rail on top moments. He's like, well, you know what? There's nothing between where you're at and where these Confederates are. And he will act as a guide to bring the 95th Ohio into position behind the Confederates who are defending this road. And the 95th sweeps in behind him and begins to start attacking from behind. Even as that's going on, a Federal commander down here, Joseph Maurer, a guy who will later earn the nickname the Swamp Lizard, he's like, I think we can take those works without even half trying. And he's going to launch his men forward in an attack, even as the 95th is coming from behind. To help cement this action, Grant's going to send an entire division under Frederick Steele down to the south and come up to help the Ohioans. And so there's going to be this convergence on this position right here that's going to allow Sherman's men to go up over the works. Now, some of my favorite writing about this battle takes place in this moment because of a bird. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Old Abe the War Eagle, but he was the mascot for the Live Eagle Brigade, which served under Maurer. And after the war, there are a number of veterans in the Live Eagle Brigade who will write biographies of this bird. And you can find them all online. If you go to archive.org, you'll see there's a small cottage industry of biographies. But because they're trying to sell, they start trying to outwrite each other. And so what starts out as a pretty factual account of the battle over the course of these competing biographies turns into this swollen purple prose that is just wonderfully obnoxious. The irresistible line of blue, undismayed and unchecked by the terrible storm of lead and iron which thins their ranks and strews the field with mangled slain, with their thundering Union cheer pealing clear above the battle's horrid din as their undaunted line sweeps up that last home stretch of bristling trench and parapet-crowned heights. Is it any wonder when they leap over those defenses that they find most of that chivalrous line in full flight to safer locations? And then later on they talk about like the pinions of the eagle spread wide and water flicking from the feathers in the storm and lightning and flashing in the sky. It's just fantastically awful. It's wonderful, yeah. So super melodramatic stuff. So even as this is now finally happening and the Federals are breaking through, over here, McPherson's guys are also going to push forward. By this point, it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I told you that the Missourians, Ohioans, and Iowans are going to come straight up the road. Of the 350 Iowans, because they're unprotected, they're going to sustain some 80 casualties. It's going to be the largest bulk of Grant's casualties in this fight, which are going to total about 300. 80 of them come from this poor Iowa regiment. Because as they advance up the road, there's going to be a Confederate artillery battery on the side that's blasting them the whole way. And as they get within close range, the artillery switches to a type of ammunition called canister, which turns those big cannons into giant shotguns. And imagine taking a point-blank range from a cannon-sized shotgun. Boom. It would take everybody out. So that's why they suffer particularly bad. But as the federal force sweeps up, they get into a fight around the Wright House. The South Carolina's colonel, or he's a lieutenant colonel at this point, Ellison Capers, who'll go on to become a bishop in the Episcopal Church, earning the nickname the Fighting Bishop. He'll actually get shot in the leg and shot off his horse. So then he tries to get back up on his horse, and he's bleeding so badly, but doesn't realize it, and he swoons and falls off his horse. And it's only the loss of blood that allows his men to haul him weakly off the battlefield. And that really sort of ends any sort of resistance here in this fight around the house. And so the Confederates fall back. Now, if you read the official reports, Joe Johnston and John Gregg will both talk about how the order had come down, that the evacuation was complete, and it's time to withdraw from both fronts and head north with the rest of the column. So from the Confederate perspective, this is not a rout, this is not a defeat, this is an orderly retreat. Just read their accounts. From the Northern perspective, it's such a sweeping, massive, fantastic, overwhelming defeat that it's no wonder they didn't capture Jackson, push all the way across Russia in the winter, and capture Moscow. Read the accounts for yourselves to sort of balance that out and assess it for yourselves. But Johnston does complete his withdrawal and push northward, and Gregg does lead the withdrawal of the defending troops northward. There's going to be a Union division over here that's going to try to cut them off, kind of go through these tables to get over to the book table, but the Confederates are able to get out in time. And that's going to allow McPherson and Sherman to come into the city. And Grant himself, traveling with Sherman, will stay at the Bowman House Hotel in the same room Joe Johnston had stayed in the night before. The same room where Johnston had sent his note saying, "I am too late." And in writing that self-fulfilling prophecy, the capital of Mississippi falls to Grant's army, the third Confederate state capital to fall in the war. But more galling is the fact that Grant has come into Jefferson Davis's home state and moved about with impunity, with no Confederate force able to stop him, not even the vaunted Joe Johnston, who looked every inch a soldier. And so after capturing capturing Jackson, Grant's army will spend the day here on the 14th, destroying anything of military value, torching a few factories, a few hotels get burned. Largely the civilian infrastructure is left alone, although that will suffer some problems in July and then later during their Meridian campaign. But Grant will then turn his attention and head off to take care of Pemberton. And they'll clash outside of Vicksburg at a place called Champion Hill on the 16th. Grant will continue to push forward, eventually get to Vicksburg. He'll make assaults on the 19th and again on the 22nd. In part, in retrospect, we look at these as sort of ill-fated attempts. But he does so in part because he knows he has Joe Johnston out here somewhere. Johnston has demonstrated himself to be ineffectual up to this point, but his reputation is enough to give Grant serious pause, although Johnston will never serve as a credible threat throughout the rest of the campaign. It's more of a specter than a real problem. And so, Jackson begins the first of several encounters with the Union Army. The capital of Mississippi falls to Ulysses S. Grant after Grant, on a spur-of-the-moment decision, decided to come here. And he leaves in his wake the foundation for what eventually will become the story of Chimneyville. And the story of Jackson gets forgotten about, not just because of the eventual fall of Vicksburg, but again because of actions out east. By the time Jackson falls, another Jackson, Stonewall, out east has died. And the Confederacy mourns their great fallen hero. Earl Van Dorn has been shot by a jealous lover in Spring Hill, Tennessee. A titillating tale, sensational in its scope. And with all of these competing events going on, with Lee worried about having to fall into the defenses of Richmond, plotting the earliest phases of what becomes the Gettysburg campaign, the story of Jackson gets forgotten. It was my privilege to come here and tell this story so that we can remember the history that we have right around us today. Thank you. So we have time for just a couple questions. Chris will come around with a microphone so that folks at home can hear us. Thank you, guys are a gracious audience. Thank you very much.
Do we happen to know the name of the black man who assisted the troops?
We do not.
Why not?
Yeah.
Surely somebody in that Yankee army recorded the name of the man who helped them take Jackson.
If that's the case, I've not been able to find that account. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we should talk to our folks at the Archives and History Department and see if they've got some documentation. But,
Other questions?
Other questions?
I have heard about Sherman burning everything in his past. How much of Jackson was burned? And was it all Sherman, or did they all destroy things?
Great question. So how much of Jackson was burned? I don't know percentage-wise, but I know that it gets worse and worse over time. At first, they're really burning military arsenals and factories that are used for manufacturing. At one point, Grant and Sherman come to a clothing factory, and the women are still working. This battle's been going on, and the women are still working. And Grant says, well, I think they've had enough work for today. And he lets them carry as many bolts of cloth as they can carry with them out so that they've got bolts of cloth to use at home, but then he torches the rest of the factory. Sherman actually puts out orders saying, don't harass civilian structures. But there's an account of one Yankee who burns down a hotel because he'd been brought through as a prisoner of war earlier in the war, and the hotel owner had been insulting to him. And so he gets his revenge by torching the hotel. So there's some of those sorts of things. But it's really after the July occupation where Sherman decides he really needs to go and get more intense with that. I can recommend a fantastic book about that by my friend Jim Woodrick, The Siege of Jackson, which takes place in July, and it can give you a little bit more about the history of Chimneywell. Other questions?
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I am curious, just this direction from here, we have a fortification street. Is that the line of fortifications to which you referred, or is that from a different military
Fortification
exercise?
Street runs along part of it, although there were, you can actually see the maps today. So there was a redan that jutted out, cotton bale redan out in that direction. So Fortification Street roughly follows, but not exactly.
So why emerging Civil War? What's emerging after, 160 years?
Yeah, great question. One of the focuses of Emerging Civil War is to really provide a platform for emerging voices in the field and to offer a venue for emerging perspectives and ideas. Now, we started this, we just celebrated our 10th anniversary last year, so I think I'm not quite the young pup that I was when I started, so maybe I've emerged. But we really make an effort to try to provide a venue for new voices, and so that's where that emerging comes from. But when you say, it's 160 years old, what is there new? People find stuff in their attics all the time, still today. New sources that we can look at. Probably a dramatic example would be the cache of papers that was found about John Bell Hood that has completely redefined our interpretation of Hood. So new stuff does turn up all the time, and it's, I think an important reason why we get together and keep talking about these things.
Yeah, I was just curious about how far north Joe Johnston's forces went after they retreated. Was there a specific location they set up or camped at? And then why was there a specific reason also that they didn't attack as they were surrounding Vicksburg for the rest of May and all throughout June, correct?
Yeah, And I think a lot of it just goes back to Johnston worried about his reputation. You know, he was convinced he was set up to fail, and so he doesn't want to come out here and fail. So he goes up to Canton. He's close enough still to the rail line because he does have reinforcements that are still using that transportation to get here. So it does still allow Jackson to serve as a transportation hub. He has access to that. And then in theory, and Grant was actually worried about this, that Johnston could make a move and cross the Big Black to the north and get down around him and stop him at Vicksburg or get him in a pincer movement. So theoretically, where Johnston is north of the city, he's got some maneuverability. But instead, he just keeps gathering troops and gathering troops. Hey, we'll be right with you. Yeah. We'll be there. Yeah, we're coming. And never comes. You know? And I think he's worried about embarrassing himself. It's the lowest point of his career, I think. Time for one last question?
Other questions? Well, I'll tell you what. I'll wander up. We got one in the back.
Well, he's making the walk here. I'll tell you real quickly because they asked me on Mississippi Public Radio yesterday, why the Battle of Jackson? Because I live on the Chancellorsville battlefield. My family owns part of the Spotsylvania battlefield. I'm a Virginia guy. I feel very strongly that it's important to write about ground you are familiar with. Several years ago, for the 155th anniversary of the Vicksburg campaign, I came out here with the American Battlefield Trust, and we did a series of videos. And so I had to kind of become an instant expert on one of the battles, because we had Terry Winchell with us, and Parker Hills, and a couple other guys, and it's like, what am I going to bring to the conversation with guys like that, you know? So I decided I was going to become the instant expert on the Battle of Jackson, because my oldest son is named Jackson. So because of that, and then I had this pile of research, and for years it's like, I got to do something with it. And so then I decided to write the book. But because, again, I feel strongly about walking the ground, I came out here and tried to familiarize myself with what remnants are left. Jim was kind enough and gracious enough to show me around. You don't have a whole lot of physical reminders of the battle left, and I think that's another reason why this particular battle has been forgotten about. So, yes, ma'am.
Continuing to follow up on Johnston, you said it was the low point of his career. I'm not clear where his high point was, but did the general feeling in the South change toward him after this? Because now it seems so clear that he just utterly failed. But was that the understanding then?
No. In fact, after Hood is repulsed from Nashville in late '64, and the remains of the Army of Tennessee are scattered to the winds, and Sherman's moving through the Carolinas, Robert E. Lee says that only Joe Johnston can stop Sherman. Like Lee, of all people, says that. And again, it's because of Johnston's reputation. So I think if he's got a high point, it's First Manassas, although Beauregard probably has more to do with the victory there than Johnston does. It's kind of all downhill after that. But he rides those coattails a long time. And then, because he has a civil surrender with Sherman at Bennett Place, and the two of them become friends, that gives Johnston a certain amount of reputational credibility in the post-war years with certain audiences. Confederates hate him. But he sort of has this respectability because he's friends with a guy who becomes general-in-chief of the Army.
Did Ulysses S. Grant have one of his sons with him that came into the city?
He did. Fred was 14 years old. He writes an account, and it reads like, and he wrote the account when I think it was in his 60s. It reads like one of those great boys' adventure tales, and he's like, oh, I rode into the city, and oh, we had the chance to go and capture the flag over the Capitol, and oh, someone got there before us, and oh, there's my dad, and it's just like thrilling, wow, ooh, ah, ah. And I don't know how dependable any of it is because he was so old by the time that he wrote it. And what's Grant like? Yeah, we're in the middle of a battle. My son's off somewhere. Great parenting there, right? So,
Thank you all for being here today. I hope that we see you this weekend for our Halloween event. I hope that we see you next Wednesday when we'll have Davis Houck and his new book, Black Bodies in the River, Searching for Freedom Summer. We have, speaking of books, Chris Mackowski's The Battle of Jackson, Mississippi, May 14, 1863, and The Summer of 63, Vicksburg and Tullahoma, co-edited by Chris and Dan Welch. Help me thank Chris Mackowski for this fabulous program today.
Thank you all.